Looking for a guaranteed way to create content that resonates with your audience? Start a podcast. Interview your ideal clients and let them choose the topic of the interview. Because if your ideal clients care about the topic, there's a good chance the rest of your audience will care about it too. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Welcome back to B2B Growth. I am your host for today's episode, Nikki Ivy with Sweetfish Media. I've got with me today Jeff White, co-founder of Kula Partners. Jeff, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Nikki. How are you?
I'm good, man. I'm glad to hear, like we talked about offline, we're both getting sunshine. So whether you're in Austin, Texas, or there in Nova Scotia, apparently it's a beautiful day.
It is, for sure. I just recorded a podcast with a guy in London, and he said it's been pouring rain since January. So we're better off than him.
Yes. So Jeff and I are going to be talking today about website accessibility, which is not something I've had the chance to discuss on the show yet. And just from the little tidbits I got offline, guys, some really interesting stuff. And I can't wait to get into it. But before we do that, Jeff, I'd love for you to just give us a little bit of background on yourself and what you and the folks at Kula Partners have been up to these days.
Sure. So Kula is a digital agency that focuses on B2B manufacturers, primarily in North America. We work with clients who have very complex sales processes, and we are lucky enough to work with some really great companies in all kinds of different manufacturing organizations. I'm also the host of a podcast myself called The Kula Ring, where we speak weekly with manufacturing marketers.
Yeah, and it's not a space I know very much about, but like I said, just based on what we talked about offline, something that more folks should be thinking about. You guys, one of the stories involves Beyoncé, but I won't give it away. Scott, talk to us a little bit about, just to frame this thing up, why is website accessibility so important?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. I mean, from a purely personal perspective, my oldest daughter actually, before she was 13 years old, had nearly a dozen surgeries on her ear. She had a lot of problems with it, and we were faced with the fact that she was probably going to be at least partially deaf going into her adult life. She's 15 now, and thankfully, everything turned out pretty much okay, although there's still plenty of times when she pretends she can't hear what my wife and I are saying to her. But, I remember thinking as we were kind of going into this the very last surgery she had, where they were going to remove her hearing bones from her right ear, that, what's her life going to be like if she can't interact normally? How is she going to be a productive adult and all of that? And, I think that's not necessarily the only reason that I'm passionate about accessibility, but I also look at it as it's kind of one of those things that we just don't get right as a web industry. We were speaking at a conference a month or so ago, and the conference organizer was good enough to send us the list of the URLs for all the companies that were going to be there. I think there were about 100. And of those, 99 of them failed basic website accessibility tests. So that means that they were not accessible in ways to blind users or others who utilize assistive technology. And, you've got a situation where 1 in 8 Americans has some form of disability. And when you're talking especially about a B2B sales process, when there could be 8, 10, 12 people involved in a buying committee, if your site isn't accessible to even one of those people, you have a serious opportunity to lose that sale. So, from a pure business perspective, it's important to me. And from a personal perspective, I want the web to be as accessible as possible to everyone. It's supposed to be the most democratized medium we've ever had. It's up in the air as to whether or not it is these days, but I think, it's certainly something that it's an achievable goal, and I would like to see us kind of get there. And there's ways to do it.
Yeah, and I can't wait to hear about some of those ways. But I'm curious, though, about the conference. How many of those folks whose websites fell short, how many of them had any idea that they were so exposed?
Almost none of them. And interestingly, the only site that passed was so old that it just basically wasn't breaking any of the rules that the newer ones were, and just happened to be built in a way that was accessible. So, I think it's the case that people just don't know how exposed they are. They don't understand what the repercussions are of this. In America, at least, you can be sued under the Americans with Disabilities Act for this exact thing. And so it's the kind of thing that if you don't understand what those rules and regulations are, you're still liable for having your site to be accessible.
Yeah, I mean, and for something like you and I talked about, something as simple as, someone's trying to buy a sweatshirt.
Yes.
And tell that story.
Sure. So it was actually just back in January 2019. A woman named Mary Connor, a blind woman, wanted to buy a Beyoncé sweatshirt and was unable to do so on the website because it was completely inaccessible to blind users. And as a result, she brought a class action suit against Beyoncé. And I don't know where it stands right now, but I remember it was a big blow up in the web world. We're just like, there are hundreds and hundreds of lawsuits every quarter being brought against companies, most of them in the B2C space, furniture companies. Target has been hit, a number of them. And, it's just not a good look. If you owned a restaurant or a retail store and someone in a wheelchair can't get in, it's going to make news. So you really don't want to be on that side. And it's not that hard to make it actually accessible to people.
Right. And so that's one of the other things that you and I talked about. Is there are common things people get wrong that they don't necessarily know that they're getting wrong. Talk a little bit about those. What are the things people miss most often?
Sure. So there's a series of guidelines called the WCAG Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG. And it details all of the things that you need to do in order to make your site accessible. And there are varying levels of accessibility within that. But the primary things that people get wrong is they don't understand contrast. So if you or I have low vision and we can see, but perhaps not that well, if you have text on a background and there isn't enough contrast between those two items, you won't necessarily be able to see it. So there are rules around the amount of contrast for large type and small type to ensure that it can be read no matter how you're looking at it. There are rules around text alternatives. So having everybody, I think, is aware of the alt text that you put in when you put an image on a website. You want to describe what it is and not just say picture or something like that, but to actually give some context as to what that is, so that someone who can't see the photo or illustration knows what it is that they're not seeing and can add context and information to the article. Audio alternatives for people who need to listen to content, so having a podcast and then having a transcription as well for people who can't hear. The other thing too is that other types of content that you might put on the site, like PDFs, are very inaccessible. So if you use a lot of PDFs and bury your content in them, there's a ton of people who aren't going to be able to download that white paper that is supposedly going to be so great, And I think that's a really big piece too that nobody even really thinks about. And then the last one that is super important is allowing people to navigate your site via keyboard. So a lot of blind users use assistive technology where they can tab through the site and kind of have the items read to them as they go through. If your site is not set up to be keyboard navigable, then you're basically blocking them and expecting them to use a mouse, but they can't see the cursor. So, you have to provide that additional ways of getting through.
Well, I suspect everybody else who is listening is feeling the same way. I kind of want to go out right now and look at our website and be like, are we getting these things wrong or right? And so that's my next question is where should people who want to get this right, where should folks start?
Well, I think, if you were to go and read the YCAG guidelines, you'd probably fall asleep. It's definitely a very technical document, and it's kind of meant for people who are building sites to know what the standards they're supposed to build to are. And so I think what you should be doing is you should be talking to your agency. If you're building a new site or you're making changes to a website, talk to them about, are you making this site accessible? And if they're not, then ask them why and get them to learn and understand exactly how that is. I mean, if 99% of organizations that we met with at this particular conference aren't making their sites accessible, then there's probably a really good chance that the designer or web development agency that you're working with isn't thinking about that thing. So building a site to be accessible has a number of other benefits too, because if you actually create it in an appropriate hierarchical way, you're building a site that is faster. It's going to load better on mobile devices. You're building a site that is more future-proofed. So as standards come in, if you create it in a way that is accessible now, it will actually be more accessible in the future as well. And, all of this also applies to all of your social media platforms and everything like that. I don't know if anybody realizes, but when you put up a photo on Instagram, one of the last things that you can do before you hit publish is add alternative content to that so that people who are browsing Instagram can actually get descriptions of what it is they're looking at. So maybe they can't see the whole photo in quite the same way that you or I can, but they can understand what's there, even if it doesn't, if it's blurry or, they have color issues or things like that. Yeah. So every LinkedIn has the same thing. If you put up a photo on LinkedIn, it will now ask you to put in alt tags for that. So there are opportunities in every platform in all of your marketing to make your content accessible to all of your potential users.
You've blown my mind.
What?
Because it's funny. I was watching something on a documentary on Netflix last night, and I was choosing. It was about Thai street chefs. Just by the way, and,
as one does,
as one does, and I selected the wrong audio. I saved the wrong one, but I selected the one that had the auto descriptions on it. Mm-hmm. And and it was doing that. It was telling me like what the picture was. And I was like, this isn't for me, but I know exactly what you're talking about. God, such good stuff. So you've told us why it's important. And there are, I think really human-centered reasons why. And I love when we are talking about business or B2B marketing, when we key in on the fact that what we're really talking about is people.
Absolutely.
And so I love that. We've talked about why it's important. It's important because it involves people, and enhancing their experience. And then there's a risk exposure. You gave us a really good place to begin as far as things that folks are getting wrong, where we can go to check ourselves, so to speak, and where folks can begin to fix stuff. So thank you so much for all of that. I have successfully picked your brain and seen what I could get out of it. And now I'm interested, Jeff, in what you are putting in it. And so I want to know, what are you reading these days? What blog, book, what learning resource have you engaged with that is informing your approach, moving you in some way? Does not have to be B2B related, but tell us what you're putting in there.
Sure. So I've been reading a lot lately. I've been traveling a ton, so I've had opportunity to read books on planes, which is not necessarily what I've been consuming for years. For a very long time, it was, if it's not on the internet, I hadn't read it. Mm-hmm. But I'm currently reading a book by a guy named Doug Hubbard called How to Measure Anything. And basically, it's about how to figure out percentages of uncertainty in business. And it's a little over my head. I went to art and design school. I did not study statistics, but a friend of mine who owns an agency in Pennsylvania turned me on to it. And it's a really interesting tool for agency owners or anybody to try and take the uncertainty out of things and begin to predict and measure things that were previously unmeasurable, like how long is it going to take to build a website, I guess. Also reading or just finished reading a book by a guy named Blair Enns, who's an agency consultant out of Vancouver, Canada, called Pricing Creativity, and basically using that to continue to refine and shape how Kula prices projects, which is pretty interesting. And on the fun side, I just read a Stephen King book, and I haven't read anything by him in a long, long time, called Under the Dome. It's about a town in Maine where all of a sudden one day it gets completely closed off from the rest of the world, and about all the chaos that happens, as so often does in a Stephen King novel. And I guess they're making a miniseries out of it. So if you don't want to read it, there's going to be a show soon, which is pretty interesting.
Also kind of like the plot of the Simpsons movie, which I only know because I have children who are obsessed with the Simpsons. And it involves a dome. They shut Springfield off. I'm sorry. You were telling us real.
No. I honestly, I'm surprised I never saw it, because I remember when it came out and it just never, I will look it up. Because I too am a huge old school Simpsons fan.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff. Like I said, man, really valuable stuff. I can't wait to have you on the show again. Folks are going to want to connect with you,
sure,
and probably ask you hashtag all the questions about web accessibility. How can folks connect with you?
Sure. So our site is kulapartners.com. You can find me there, and I'm on Twitter, and my username there is Bright White.
Got it. All right. Well, thank you so much, Jeff. Have a good one.
Thanks a lot, Nikki.
We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with. That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big Three, a no-fluff email that boils down our 3 biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.